There'll be no more kneeling, no more bowing, no more kneeling after a while, no more weeping, no more crying, no more weeping after a while. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be my Lord, and to go home to be with my Lord and be free.
We're going to move from the Caribbean and Latin America. You may have noticed last time that we discussed Mexico, or the gentleman discussed slavery in Mexico, and we hadn't even gotten to North America. I'm still trying to figure this out, how Mexico isn't a part of North America. So I went along with the conceit there. But I do have that problem. And one of the things you'll learn, another thing you'll learn is that this New World slavery is unique, distinct, different from other forms of slavery heretofore, because this kind of slavery is racial slavery. Now, we know there were some Irish revolutionaries who were enslaved and shipped to the West Indies, and perhaps some other whites who, for one reason or another, were enslaved. But slavery for them did not mean the same thing as it did for the Africans. It did not mean slavery for life. It did not mean their children would be enslaved. It did not mean the enslavement of Irish women and selling them to the West Indies, unless I'm wrong about that. Someone can correct me if I am. So, New World slavery was racial slavery. Distinctive, different, all the more invidious. Anna Everett, from Film Studies, winner of this year's Plouse Award, will be the moderator for our second panel.
I am so happy to see you all here today, and this is such an important topic, and I think the timing of this conference is really perfect. I think with the debates about reparation going on legislatively in the nation, I think that the reflections that we'll have here, the insights that we gain here, I think will advance the debate beyond the sort of attitude of incredulity that black people have claims to some form of reparation for slavery. I do want to say that I concur that we need to deal with the sickness of racism in the States, but I have to respectfully disagree with my esteemed colleague, Professor Hill, because I do want my 40 acres and a mule, so I think this idea of reparations and acknowledging that has something, I think, some value. But let me just get on and introduce the outstanding panel that you will be hearing from today. And also, I want to tell you that your respondent or your commenter today will be Doug Daniels. But let me introduce the panel in the order that they will appear. We're beginning with Frederick Knight of the University of Virginia. The title of his talk is In an Ocean of Blue, The Uneven Legacies of Colonial South Carolina Indigo Plantations. Professor Frederick Knight teaches African American history at the University of Memphis and is currently a Carter G. Woodson Institute Fellow at the University of Virginia. A few years ago, he was a dissertation fellow in the Center for Black Studies here at UCSB, so welcome back. His paper we're looking forward to very much. Our second presenter will be Thelma Foote from UC Irvine, who I recently met at the Blackness Conference at UC Davis, which was a wonderful experience a couple of weeks ago, actually. The title of her paper is Separate but Equal for Masters and Slaves, Apartheid Logic, Historiography in the U.S. And Professor Thelma Foote is in the Department of History at UC Irvine and was historian of the African Burial Ground Project in Manhattan. She has written Crossroads or Settlement, the Freedmen's Community in Historic Greenwich Village from 1644 to 1844. And another work, Black and White Manhattan, Race Relations and Collective Identity in Colonial Society, 1626 to 1783, which is forthcoming. Finally, last but not least, is Mr. Mark Mack, and the title of his paper, he's from Howard University, and the title of his paper is A Mirror into the Past, the Biological Effects of Enslavement on the Ancestors of the African Burial Ground. Mr. Mack is the laboratory director of the African Burial Ground Project and an instructor in biological anthropology at Howard University. He is also currently a doctoral candidate in biological anthropology at the University of Florida. And I'd like you to join me in a warm round of applause for our speakers.
I think it's somewhat apropos that I begin this panel, because in some ways my paper is a bridge between the discussions of slavery in the Caribbean and slavery in the North American mainland. We see that process occurring in the development of indigo plantations in colonial South Carolina. Between 1740 and 1770, colonial South Carolina emerged as one of Great Britain's principal suppliers of indigo. In 1750, South Carolina exported approximately 87,000 pounds of indigo that soon gained a reputation as a middle-grade textile dye, next in quality to the highest grade produced in Guatemala and the French Caribbean. Between the mid-century and the American Revolution, a period that coincided with an increased importation of enslaved workers from West Africa, the colony's indigo exports expanded more than tenfold to over 1 million pounds per year. How did this expansion happen? What shaped the development of indigo plantations in colonial South Carolina? In what ways did indigo shape colonial South Carolina? What were the legacies of indigo production in South Carolina? My paper will address these questions and argue that the history of colonial South Carolina offers us crucial insights into and had a number of consequences upon the development of the culture, economy, and society of the Atlantic world. Among the ideological consequences of the development of South Carolina indigo plantations has been the celebration of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and as a corollary, what Cedric Robinson terms the destruction of the African past, and I'll make that clear in the latter part of my paper. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, the mother of American Revolutionary heroes Thomas Pinckney and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, has been the subject of biographies, children's books, and even a novel has been written about her and has been given credit for permanently establishing indigo production in colonial South Carolina. Pinckney was the granddaughter of John Lucas, who in 1713 established rice plantations in South Carolina. In 1738, John Lucas's son George left Antigua to live on the Carolina estates. His political aspirations soon called George Lucas back. I'm not sure there's any relation to the producer. Soon called George Lucas back to Antigua, leaving his daughter Eliza the authority to manage his property for him. She managed 3 plantation sites, one at Wapu, where the family lived, one at Garden Hill on the Combahee River in South Carolina, which was a 1,500-acre property that produced pitch, salt, pork, tar, and other commodities, and also a 3,000-acre rice plantation on the Waccamaw River. A number of sources credit Eliza Lucas for developing indigo into a major cash crop in South Carolina. For instance, according to agricultural historian Lewis Cecil Gray, who many later researchers have followed, quote, "The credit for initiating the indigo industry is due Eliza Lucas, who had recently come from the West Indies to South Carolina, where she resided on an estate belonging to her father, then governor of Antigua." In similar fashion, one recent colonial historian has written, quote, "Eliza Lucas, later Pinckney, especially labored to introduce, Eliza Lucas, later Pinckney, especially labored to introduce West Indian indigo cultivation." Ironically, the focus on Pinckney as innovator both masks and reveals a number of historical processes by, on the one hand, ignoring the questions of who actually did the work on her plantations, and on the other hand, indicating the colony's interconnection with the larger Atlantic world. And what I'm trying to do is look at these plantations and connect them with some historical processes that connected South Carolina with Caribbean and West Africa and even India. So as important as the Lucas estate was, the innovations that occurred there and elsewhere in South Carolina can best be explained by shifting the focus from Eliza Lucas to larger political, social, and economic contexts. Among the central factors that gave rise to indigo production in South Carolina were the voids in the colony and the British imperial economy. While in the mid to late 17th century, Great Britain looked to both the Americas and India for indigo. The cost of indigo in India went up in the late 17th and early 18th century, in part because of increased demand for indigo in India and the Middle Eastern textile industries, and also as a result of changes in the road tolls and tribute collected from peasants. This helped to create a demand from the American colonies for indigo, which the War of Jenkins' Ears from 1739 to 1742 further stimulated. This conflict between Britain and Spain and France cut South Carolina planters off from its European markets and prompted them to diversify the colony's economy. They needed to look no farther than the Caribbean islands for models. Aware of indigo development on Caribbean slave plantations, including her home of Antigua, which produced indigo in the early 18th century, Eliza Lucas wrote her father on the island on a number of occasions for indigo seeds. In July 1740, she wrote in her letter book, quote, "On the pains I had taken to bring indigo to perfection and had great hopes from the indigo, if I could have the seed earlier next year from the West Indies than any of the rest of the things I had tried," writing as if she had done work in the fields herself. The following year, after a frost destroyed most of the indigo crop, she wrote, quote, "I make no doubt indigo will prove a very valuable commodity in time if we could have the seed from the West Indies in time enough to plant the latter end of March, that the seed might be dry enough to gather before our frost." Though Lucas requested seeds from the Caribbean, who actually did the work on our plantation, leading me again to the question I raised in my introduction. Records from her plantation reveal that it mobilized labor from both West Africa and the Caribbean. Lucas looked to the Caribbean for craft workers to make indigo vats. Beginning in 1741, her father sent a skilled craft worker to construct indigo vats and oversee the process of indigo manufacture. The Lucas estate first employed Patrick Cromwell and then his brother Nicholas, both from the island of Montserrat, but Eliza Lucas dismissed them both, suspecting that they had sabotaged the operation, fearing that she and possibly other Carolinians would provide undue competition with their home island. In response, Governor Lucas of Antigua looked elsewhere in the Caribbean for skilled labor. In particular, he turned toward the French West Indies for workers experienced with indigo. By the early 18th century, slave labor produced indigo in Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. Allowing for investment by small planters, these islands generally used 10 to 12 slaves who carried out the different stages of production, including cultivation, building vats, and reducing the plant to dye. Certainly aware of the French Caribbean model and hoping to establish indigo manufacturing on his Carolina estates, Governor Lucas sent a black indigo worker from a French island to South Carolina who implemented the experiment with indigo. Soon after, the Lucas estate profited not only from rice but also indigo production. While on the one hand mobilizing Afro-Caribbean labor, the Lucas estate also received inputs of labor more directly from West Africa. A 1742 inventory of slaves on her Garden Hill property, a site of indigo production beginning in 1744, listed 35 men, 16 women, 17 boys, and 11 girls, including workers named Kwamina, Kwashi, Kwao, Kweku, which appear twice on this particular inventory, and Kufi. The names indicate origins from the West African Gold and Ivory Coast or the interiors, where indigo-dyed textiles were produced along with a range of other agricultural and craft goods. In particular, cottage industries in the states of Bono and Akuapem and the towns of Bego and Banduku and the hinterlands produced and refined cotton and indigo to support their textile industries. Swept through by Asante armies in the first half of the 18th century that in turn sold the captives to European slave traders, these areas supplied the Americas with slave labor. Though it remains uncertain whether the Akan-speaking slaves on the Lucas plantation had experienced with indigo production before crossing the Atlantic, it's certainly possible that they did. Subsequently, over the next several decades, labor from West Africa's Senegambia region contributed nearly 1/3 of the slaves imported into South Carolina between 1749 and 1787, becoming one of the most predominant sources of the colony's sources of labor for the colony's indigo and rice fields. In this regard, it is worth noting that it was not unusual for West African communities to grow rice that grew rice as a staple crop to also grow indigo. The landscape of West Africa's rice region, which varied from damp floodplains and swamps to drier upland fields, accommodated indigo cultivation that is suited to drier soils. Several 18th and 19th century accounts of the West African coast testify to the relationship between these crops. For example, Michael Adamson, a British naturalist who surveyed the geography of the Senegambian region in the mid-18th century, noted that in drier upland soils, millet, cotton, and indigo were placed under cultivation. Rice, in contrast, was, quote, almost the only grain sown at Gambia in the lands overflown by the rains of the high season. The Negroes cut all these lands with small causes, which withhold the waters in such a manner that the rice is always moistened. Now, bringing experience with indigo that ranged from cultivation to processing and dyeing, the work of indigo production was transformed within the New World context. In contrast to West Africa, indigo workers in South Carolina performed little or no dyeing and also worked with different kind of indigo vats, the plans of which colonists had transferred to the Americas from India by the middle of the 17th century. Furthermore, as a number of sources attest, indigo production in West Africa was often controlled by women who mastered cultivation, processing, and dyeing techniques, but in the Americas, women were generally excluded from processing and generally worked only in the indigo fields. Yet their expertise was not lost upon planters such as Henry Lawrence, whose slave Hagar developed a reputation for her, quote, great care of indigo in the mud, end of quote. In these ways, African workers both drew upon previous knowledge in shaping South Carolina's indigo plantations and adapted to different means of production and divisions of labor. And one might even extend this to geography, which I'm not going to really explore in this paper, but one can also push that argument as well. Accompanying the development of indigo on the Lucas estate and elsewhere in colonial South Carolina was an expansion of symbolic and cultural capital, yet another legacy of South Carolina indigo production. Once indigo was established on the Lucas estate, knowledge about how to cultivate and process the crop became much more available to literate white Carolinians, most of whom, like Eliza Lucas in the early stages of indigo production on her plantation, had little practical knowledge about the crop. Throughout the 1740s and beyond, South Carolina planters could thumb through the pages of publications such as the South Carolina Gazette and other places for instructions about how to raise indigo. And you can go through this one article after another would detail the requirements of cultivating and processing and building vats for it and so on. Now, during the colonial period, what I'm arguing in some ways is that the written descriptions of indigo then became a kind of currency that circulated among Carolina elites who hoped to capitalize on European demand for high-quality indigo and match the standard set by Guatemala. This attention was aided in some ways in 1757, when a group of planters established the Winya Indigo Society in Georgetown. Modeled after the Charleston Library Society, it served as a clearinghouse for information on indigo and other matters, and it also established a school for indigent children. Through these circuits, South Carolina's cultural capital expanded and established precedents for agricultural journals, such as the Southern Agriculturalist, the Edmund Ruffin's Farmer's Register, which would be established in the 1830s, and the Bowes Review Journal, which would be established in the 1840s, that would influence the culture of the antebellum South. Now, South Carolina elites, with time freed up by the profits derived from slave labor, also produced forms of symbolic capital, if you will, related to indigo that reflected and shaped white colonial identities and promoted the state to outsiders. One finds this particularly on the cartouches on colonial South Carolina maps that went through a number of interesting changes. So could you put the first one on there? Now, in this first cartouche, which was printed on a 1757 map by William de Bram, there are appearing two statuesque black male figures in the back who are removing water from the indigo vat, and also another who seems almost delighted in his work. It looks almost as if he has a smile on his face, dividing indigo into blocks for shipment. And we may be able to do some things with these images a little bit later, but given that we don't have much time, I'd like to move on to the next one, which is a cartouche published on James Cook's 1773 map of South Carolina, which shows 4 primary characters: a black male figure loading a ship with indigo, 2 gentlemen overseeing the process, and a Native American male in the corner. Here, these 2 gentlemen seem to feel at relative ease in navigating their way in between the archetypal noble savage on their right and the mindless, laboring black male on their left. Now, the third is from a 1773 Henry Mouzon map. And I'm sorry, we don't have enough time to really go into these in any detail, much detail. Now here the emphasis is on the technology and efficiency of indigo plantations, indicated by the ceaseless motion of the workers, the presence and cleanliness of their uniforms, and the proximity of indigo fields, vats, and sorting areas. This sense of order is heightened by the presence of white overseers, in contrast to the 1757 image where they were absent. These images did a number of things simultaneously, I'm arguing. They revealed historical processes of material production, displayed clearly defined roles and expectations for black and white males in the colony, and concealed the role of enslaved women from the process of indigo production. In these cartouches, particularly Mozoon's, the artist's portrayal of South Carolina as an essentially progressive society, the artist portrayed South Carolina as an essentially progressive society, a vision that stimulated the desire to introduce rice mills and other machinery into South Carolina after the Revolution. Now, in contrast to the planters' ideas and symbols about indigo, the slave community developed alternative ideas in relation to indigo, some of which were related to West or Central African cosmologies. Into the 19th century, the Gullah attributed spiritual significance to the color blue. In some cases, the Gullah painted their doors blue with residue from the indigo vats, and in others, Gullah conjurers gave their patients blue pills, apparently for protection from malevolent spirit beings. And Julie Dash draws upon these archetypes in Daughters of the Dust, as in the prominence of indigo-dyed textiles worn by and the blue-stained hands of Nana Pazant. While the Gullah community saw within indigo and blue certain healing principles, the physical toll that indigo production imposed on the bodies of the enslaved could not have been lost on them. One mid-18th century white reformer noted that the work of pounding indigo with mortar and pestle placed a tremendous burden upon the bodies of the enslaved. In addition, indigo workers battled swarms of flies that attended the process of steeping indigo leaves in the vats that in turn prompted the spread of disease. And in relation to indigo production in the British Caribbean, and by implication, South Carolina, Brian Edwards, who was really had very little sympathy for black people, acknowledged the high mortality of the Negroes from the vapor of the fermented liquor, an alarming circumstance that, as I am informed both by the French and English planners, constantly attends the process. Though a steady source of wealth for South Carolina during the colonial period, indigo production went into a general decline in the late 18th century. With the rise of cotton textile production in Great Britain in the early 19th century, indigo production expanded in India, where between 1834 and 1847, 4 million people worked in indigo production, interestingly enough, almost equal to the number of slaves in the United States in 1860. Through a combination of British policies and local practices, Indian peasants were forced to grow indigo rather than rice and fell into a circle of debt that reduced them to virtual slavery, creating the conditions for the 1859 Bengal Rebellion. Indigo production endured into the 20th century, but has been gradually replaced by the production of synthetic dyes in the Western industrialized nations. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, during the late 18th and early 19th century, indigo production was replaced by cotton, of course, and one such plantation later became the site of Augusta National Golf Course, home of the Masters Golf Championship. While indigo production collapsed in colonial South Carolina and gave way to different uses of land and different kinds of technologies, it produced a number of historical legacies. The most obvious is the wealth it placed in the hands of colonists such as Lucas and the Pinckney families, and also small planters who did not have the resources to invest in larger enterprises such as rice plantations. Another was the creation of semi-public schools the semi-public school established by the Winya Indigo Society that, though it died in the mid-19th century, established a precedent for segregated public schools in South Carolina, the consequences of which still haunt, if you will, modern education. And in addition, were the clearly traumatic effects that working on indigo plantations had upon the bodies of the enslaved. Others can be mentioned, and I know we don't like to use the word trauma, but when we talk about the kind of work regimen imposed upon enslaved workers, it clearly did have that effect. Now, in conclusion, my research essentially agrees with anthropologist Michelle Ralph Trudeau, who is seen to be fairly popular this morning, who states in Silencing the Past, quote, that U.S. slavery has both officially ended, yet continues in many complex forms, most notably institutionalized racism and the cultural denigration of blackness makes its representation particularly burdensome in the United States. Slavery here is a ghost, both the past and the living present. This leaves one with a task of working towards putting the ghosts of slavery to rest. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd first like to thank Professor Douglas Daniels for inviting me. This looks to be a very stimulating conference. Hi again, Anna. It was great meeting you and glad to see you here. I see a number of other people I know from around the UC system and from various universities in the U.S. This paper today is a contribution to, I think, setting up a discussion that should happen at the end of the conference on reparations. But it's also a paper that is trying to deal with the study of rhetoric in the U.S. historiography on slavery, something that's often overlooked in overviews of slavery and that I think will play a major part in any debate on reparations. The basic aim of this paper is to call attention to the binary logic that structures canonical historiography on slavery in the United States. And again, many of my points will probably apply, and we can talk about this in question and answer, to historiographies that either are written in other languages or that deal with slavery in other parts of the world. But I'm narrowing my focus here to canonical historiography on slavery in the U.S. In order to do so, this paper takes a close look at a protocol of the historical profession in the United States that sustains and legitimates a dominant historiographical tradition, namely the institutional imperative of narrative history. My main thesis is the following. Since the publication of U.B. Phillips's American Negro Slavery in 1918, historical writing on slavery has taken the form of an objective social scientific discourse that seems or pretends to forego narrative, yet is fully anchored in foundational meta-narratives whose binary logic of identity and difference renders illegible the subjugated knowledges of the masses of enslaved black Africans and their descendants in the West. The paper, I hope, offers an appropriate contribution to this conference named Legacies of Slavery, Unequal Exchange, for it seeks to problematize the unequal exchange inscribed in some of the most influential historiography on U.S. slavery. Again, in anticipation of our final discussion on the debate surrounding reparations, I hope to suggest that the dominant historiography, historiographical tradition on U.S. slavery offers a legacy that does not necessarily support the global struggle for redress of historic injustices against people of African descent. The discipline of history is a narrative mode of knowing, explaining, reconstructing the past, and rendering it meaningful. A meta-narrative of one sort or another typically subtends all historiography, even historical writing that, on the surface, seems to privilege themes, problem-solving, interpretation, analysis, etc., and appears at first glance to be organized around non-narrative, social scientific methodologies, conceptualizations, and theorizing, with no apparent attempt to posit or tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end. For example, economic history, Marxist history, the French and all schools, the new social history that's been so dominant in the historiography on slavery in the U.S. They're all grounded in the meta-narrative of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, whose binary logic of non-contradiction posits a radical rupture of temporality, only, and I underscore this, only to reconstitute a homogeneous empty time in and through its discursive production of the story of human progress. That is, a telos that begins with the Ancien regime and ends with the advent of modernity. Such narration in the historiography of slavery posits relationally constituted but separated identities. We've already touched on some already today. The question of modernizing indigo production, the contribution of Native Africans to that process. we can think of other binaries that are just basically generic staples, if you will, of U.S. historiography or any historiography that is founded or anchored in the meta-narrative of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, primitivism versus modernism. In the recent historiography that's coming up, a question between native Africans, where the people of the African diaspora in the United States, primarily native Africans, unassimilated, unacculturated, read primitive, or were they creolized? Today, in listening to Professor Hill's discussion, what came to mind is another binary construct that emerges out of the historiography is the question of agency versus victimization. All of this is being played out and will be played out, I think, in the reparations debate, but is already present in some of the foundational or canonical historiography on slavery in the United States. So these are the kinds of separate identities that I think a historiography that's subtended by this meta-narrative of the transition from feudalism to capitalism engenders. In doing so, though, these kinds of historiographies disavow the historical complexities that gave rise to cultural hybridity, alternative epistemologies, and social ontologies of the enslaved people in the so-called New World. More generally, the Enlightenment narrative of human progress discounts the role of slavery as an instrumentality of colonialism, a mode of domination that enabled European expansionism, and as I argue in Black and White Manhattan, characteristically juxtapose the archaic and the modern. To summarize my points so far, what Paul Ricoeur calls the eclipse of narrative merely amounts to the substitution of an implicit master narrative for an explicit deployment of narrative structure. In historical writing on slavery, narrative and its binary logic has served to render illegible the historical knowledge of enslaved Black Africans and at its logical extreme, to deny the slave a status as a subject who acts in the world. Moreover, where the slave arises as a subject of history, his or her actions and the motivations behind them are generally attributed to the slave's assimilation of the dominant values, systems of representation, and worldview of the West. I'm going to start with, I believe I have enough time. How much? Plenty of time? Good. With these two basic typologies. The one that renders the slave really basically an object with no agency, and another trend in the historiography that at least purports to attribute some agency to the slave. The first, I'll begin with a guy who started this debate, U.B. Phillips, American Negro Slavery, published in 1918. This is sort of the primal scene, if you will, the inaugural moment in the formation of this first typology in U.S. historiography on slavery. Elevated to the status of a titan among the first generation of professional historians in the U.S., Phillips produced the most influential body of historical scholarship on the plantation South and its regime written prior to the 1950s. Contemporary reviews in the prominent professional journals and the accolades of the American Historical Association lauded Phillips's American Negro Slavery, again published in 1918, and Life and Labor in the Old South in 1929, for its innovative introduction of objective social scientific methodologies and use of unbiased documentary evidence. The social scientific methodology which Phillips brokered in some respects into the historical profession in the United States, established the standards of protocol of U.S. historiography on slavery, even for his critics and their students, for example, Richard Hofstadter, Stanley Elkins, and Kenneth Stamp with two Ps. And I would argue also those very same methodological standards and protocols shaped and dominated the so-called new social history of a later generation. Whereas Phillips engaged his white critics in print and at professional meetings, he preferred to stand above the fray of debates with black intellectuals. Observing that Phillips ignored the criticism of W.E.B. Du Bois and other black scholars, John David Smith writes, quote, "Ironically, Phillips mastered the primary sources on slavery left by the antebellum white planters, yet failed to read the black literature of his own day. Most likely too," and this is an extension of Smith's quote, "most likely too, he was suspicious of the work of black authors because of its polemic nature. And even if he had read their works, Phillips was too much of a product of his Southern origins in the Jim Crow era to comprehend fully their significance. Resembling most white scholars of the age, Phillips simply did not take blacks, even black intellectuals, seriously." Close quote. Phillips's Southern origins was not the only or even the most important factor contributing to his refusal to acknowledge blacks as the subjects of history, let alone interpreters of it. Along with his exclusionary, silencing, citational practices, Phillips deployed the social scientific discourse of economic history, a power knowledge regime that has no place for the slave except as a constituent of labor, a living tool, hardly a subject who acts in the world. And although Phillips's influential production of knowledge about the plantation South and its system of slavery pretends to avoid the pitfalls of polemic narrative accounts of the past, his seemingly objective methodology does narrate, for it structures the evidence that comprises the content of his scholarly monographs and articles in ways that bias or predetermine his truth claims. In fine, Phillips narrates the story of paternalistic Southerners, his own ancestors, whose archaic feudal worldview led them to buy ever more land and slaves without much regard for profit, and whose way of life was eventually swept away by the winds of progress that announced the advent of modernity in the southern United States. It's certainly interesting to note that Eugene Genovese wrote the foreword to the 1966 republication of Phillips's American Negro Slavery. Though Genovese's remarks on Phillips's anti-black racism, his preface is primarily a pan to the great Southern historian, whose historical writing shares with his own an affinity for the meta-narrative that chronicles the passage from feudalism to capitalism. Genovese's is perhaps the most accomplished scholar in a long line of historians whose intellectual genealogy can be traced back to U.B. Phillips. But Genovese's departs from Phillips in insisting that the slaves created their own world and were hence subjects of history and not, as the subtitle of Phillips's magnum opus suggests, merely a supply of labor controlled and determined by the plantation regime. Now, we can start the second typology, the typology in U.S. historiography that begins to give some agency to the slave with Herbert Apthecker's work or Kenneth Stamp's study, Peculiar Institution, 1956. I'm just going to use Genovese's as my example for now. In any case, Genovese's and Phillips share this preoccupation that's not always explicitly stated, at least in Phillips's work, certainly relies on, and their work is guided by this meta-narrative of the passage from feudalism to capitalism. The distinction between Phillips and Genovese's is a simple one, perhaps important, perhaps not in the reparations debate, about whether or not slaves were subjects of history with agency or were just merely constituents of labor. Focusing on the veiled narrativity of Genovese's social scientific historiography, that is, that there is a narrative there, the narrative of the passage from feudalism to capitalism. We see that, for example, in Genovese's From Rebellion to Revolution. Note the dispensation of a telos in the title. Argues, this text, that the slave did not emerge as a subject in the history of the modern West until the enslaved masses adopted the emergent ideology of the age of democratic revolutions, the Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and human progress. Before that world historic event, the masses of slaves are hardly intelligible as subjects and are represented as confused, disoriented rebels who attempt to restore themselves to a traditional way of life that is, in fact, forever lost. In Black and White Manhattan, I subscribe to this same meta-narrative, but place its truth claim under erasure by pointing out that it is the narrative structuration, form, not content or the actual experiences of slaves, that render the slave legible at all as a modern subject who acts in the world. In an earlier article titled Some Hard Usage, the New York Slave Revolt of 1712, I foregrounded the alternative epistemologies and social ontologies of enslaved native African rebels in a way, I hope, that called into question the teleological narrative of human progress that structures the story of the Black African's journey from slavery to freedom. The point was simply that although this slave revolt was a failed slave revolt, in studying it, we learned something about Black humanity and alternative humanity, and in doing so demarcate, another subject position other than the self-same subject of that's modeled on the white European male and all of the models that come from it. Interestingly, Benjamin Quarles's The Negro in the American Revolution, published in 1961, I think exemplifies the from slavery to freedom narrative in that it aims not only to document the Negro's contribution to the American Revolution, a world historic event, but also to demonstrate that the Negro became a subject of a formative event in the history of the modern West, and in doing so earned his freedom. Writing about the Negro in the white American War for Independence, Quarles basically makes the argument that the Negro is a subject of history, by virtue not only of the contributions but also of acting. Quarles relates the responses of Blacks in an action-based narrative in which individual Black action heroes exchange military service for freedom. In Quarles' narrative, the ex-slave appears to come out on the winning end of the bargain, even though Quarles makes note of an unavoidable fact, namely that the masses of Blacks remained in bondage. His narrative nonetheless stresses human progress and the active agency of slaves, who numbered certainly in the tens of thousands. In this respect, his narrative tends to obscure the unequal exchange in which white Americans and white Brits dictated the terms by which slaves obtained freedom during the War for Independence. A more recent monograph in the same tradition as Sylvia Fry's Water from the Rock that was published in 1991, and there are many, many others. But that's my second typology, basically. With the unfolding of time, this meta-narrative of human progress tells us we all become the heirs to the separate but equal history for masters and slaves. This is a dispensation of a telos, the gift of homogeneous empty time, making reparations unnecessary. Listen to what Frantz Fanon has to say on this score. Am I going to ask the contemporary white man to answer for the slave ships of the 17th century? Am I going to try every possible means to cause guilt to be born in minds? Moral anguish in the face of the massiveness of the past? I am a Negro, and tons of change, storms of blows, rivers of expectoration flow down my shoulders. But I do not have the right to allow myself to be bogged down. I do not have the right to allow the slightest fragment to remain in my existence. I do not have the right to allow myself to be mired in what the past has determined. I am not the slave of the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. To many colored intellectuals, European culture has a quality of exteriority. What is more, in human relationships, the Negro may feel himself a stranger to the Western world, not wanting to live the part of the poor relative, of an adopted son, of a bastard child. Shall he feverishly seek to discover Negro civilization? Let us be clearly understood. I am convinced that it would be of the greatest interest to be able to have contact with a Negro literature or architect of the 3rd century before Christ. I should be very happy to know that the correspondence correspondence had flourished between some Negro philosophers and Plato. But I cannot see how this fact would change anything in the lives of the 8-year-old children who labor in the cane fields of Martinique and Guadeloupe. No attempt must be made to encase man, for it is his destiny to be set free. The body of history does not determine a single one of my actions. I am my own foundation, and it is by going beyond the historical, instrumental hypothesis that I will initiate the cycle of my freedom. The disasters of the man of color lies in the fact that he was enslaved. The disaster and inhumanity of the white man lie in the fact that somewhere he has killed man. And even today they subsist to organize this dehumanizing rationally. But I am a man of color to the extent that it becomes possible for me to exist absolutely. Do not have the right to lock myself into a world of retroactive reparations. Here, finally, Fanon merely recognizes the limit the West imposes on him and others as modern subjects, a limit, paradoxically, that much of modern historical writing on slavery reinforces. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Mack, and I'm a biological anthropologist in a sea of historians, so I feel like a stranger in a strange land. But anyway, what I'm going to show you today is really primary evidence, primary resource material of the legacy of slavery. What I'm about to show you are the enslaved Africans themselves. Those people that somehow, believe it or not, survived the Middle Passage. And those people that we as African Americans come from. So let me begin. Here you see one of the earliest victims of globalization. This is a 5-year-old child. Can we turn off the lights? Maybe. Please. Pretty please. Thank you. Here is a wood print that was made in 1647 that's basically a travel brochure to come to the new colony of New Amsterdam. You can see on the right a man holding a goose or a duck. On the left is a Dutch woman holding a bountiful harvest of fruits and vegetables. But at the bottom here, you can see Africans, both male and female. This is a surveyor's map that was made in 1754 of then called New York City, but Manhattan. And you can see in yellow, it is named the Negroes' Burial Ground. And it's named the Negroes' Burial Ground because the British named it. You can also see the blue little lake there. That is a collect pond. But to the Native Americans that lived in this area, the Lenape-speaking Indians, that was a sacred site. You have to think to yourself, for the Africans that lived in this colony, the burial ground was a sacred site as well. This is what the site looked like in 1990. General Services Administration, which is an arm of the federal government, was charged with putting an office tower at 290 Broadway. So what you're seeing here is the construction. And this is really the living floor of the 1700s. You can see that there's about 20 or 30 feet that go up to the street level. And that's landfill that was put on top of the cemetery that both obscured it, but in an odd way preserved it. These are excavators working at the site. And I think you can see the density or the high number of Africans that were buried at this site. Now, there were 409 individuals taken from the cemetery itself, but it is estimated that there are still at least 10,000 people buried in that cemetery. 10,000 people that have on top of them office buildings, that have abutted to them the U.S. federal courthouse. Eventually, and initially I should say, The excavations of these individuals was kept private. The public did not know what was going on. Either one of the excavators or one of the construction workers let it be known to a local radio station that they were digging at an African American cemetery. And I think you would think that people got upset by that fact. And you also have a combination of science and politics begin at this time too. You can see Mayor Dinkins. And this gentleman in the blue and tan was one of the original archaeologists working on the site. Here is Trinity Church. This, I think, has importance because we know that it was built by 1697. And after it was built, in the church bylaws, it states, no Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave of any parishioner can be buried in the churchyard cemetery. There is a question of when the cemetery, the African burial ground, is started. Some say 1712, but we believe very strongly it goes back into the mid-17th century, into the mid-1600s. We know that it is closed in 1796. And of course, you can see people protesting the fact that they're digging up this site with no research plan or research design on what to do with the remains. As a matter of fact, GSA stated that they would put a $250,000 plaque in the new building, and that should serve for the memory of these ancestors. And as you can see, people did not agree with that. Now that the remains are here at Howard University, these are our four major research questions. First of all, who are these people biologically and genetically? Secondly, what's the physical quality of life? What was it like to be African, living in New York City 250 years ago? Thirdly, how have we evolved from these first African populations into the African Americans that we are now? And then finally, we have this fourth question, modes of resistance. But after thinking about this more closely and really letting the ancestors speak for themselves, it is a question of how did they maintain their humanity, more so than just resisting. Here is a burial of a newborn baby. That little baby came to our lab in this condition. It is important for us to find out how old this child is. So using dental picks and a number of students, that little child is this little baby here. And I think this is where you might think or begin to think that it's not just an object of scientific or historic curiosity. This is a baby that never made it to 1 year of age. This is some mother's child, some daddy's child. In terms of population origins, we are not interested in finding out if they're Negroid, Caucasoid, or Mongoloid. Those are really artificial typologies that have been placed on us as human beings. We are more interested in finding out if they're Mende, Fulani, Ashanti, French, Irish, Lenape. So in doing that, we've been able to extract DNA, we've been able to extract bone and dental chemistry. But GSA, General Services Administration, is contractually obligated to fund our work. Guess what they will not fund? The DNA in bone and dental chemistry. Money. Money. But there are other things that we can see in terms of cultural and population affiliation. Here you're looking at the teeth of a man that died in his 40s, and his incisors have been filed into a wedge shape. We have found at least 9 dental modification patterns affecting at least 27 individuals. According to the anthropological literature, these are people that were born and raised in Africa, because these dental modifications are done in a social context. They are aesthetically pleasing. They are an ethnic identifier. They are a rite of passage. Here you can see the hourglass shape. Here you have a wave pattern, where you see the bottom teeth have little points, the maxillary teeth have little concave indentations, so that when he opens his mouth, there's a little wave. These are the teeth of a 50-year-old woman. Dental modification is not only limited to men. I mean, women did it as well. Also, this woman was found with waist beads around her hips. Those are the innominate bones that you're looking at. Also on her right arm, she has a bracelet. Our archaeologists have come to the conclusion that these are not American in origin. These are probably African in origin. Now, we're taught that Africans lost their language, lost their culture. She brings something with her. And you can see similar waist beads in the early 1900s with these girls from Liberia. We also have this cultural pattern that shows us this man smoked a pipe. Think if you were enslaved and had to work 16 to 18 hours. Any creature comfort you can come by, you'll come by. In terms of the physical quality of life, 40% of the 409 individuals are children. 25% of the 409 individuals are children under the age of 2. What you're seeing here is the arm of a woman, and in that arm is her little baby. Here is a woman that died in her late 30s. These are both of her upper arms, and what I'm trying to show here is that the pectoralis muscle attaches to your arm right here. She was forced to either push or lift something so heavy that the pectoralis muscle pulled away from the arm, and it took a piece of bone with it. 60% of the adult women have these muscle tears. She also has a split of the spinous process of the thoracic vertebra. In other words, having to lift or push something so heavy, she also broke her back or her vertebral column. She has very poor dental health, a mouth full of cavities. But I think what is most touching about this is that when she died, her baby died as well. Now, when I first saw this, I thought it was a breech birth. You can see that the legs are coming out first. But the baby was placed on the mother, this high up. The mother died in childbirth. The baby died in childbirth. But they weren't just thrown into ditches. The mother was wrapped in a white cotton shroud, placed in her coffin. The baby was placed with her, obviously to go into the afterlife together. And for me, this is the biggest lesson of the legacy of slavery. This love for each other, because these are not just Africans coming from Ghana. These are Africans coming from Ghana, Senegal, Benin, Angola, Namibia, Mozambique. How do we know that? From the DNA. Here you see the bones of a 6-year-old child that were affected by rickets. This child also has enamel defects and vitamin C deficiency, or scurvy. And this child has a misshapen skull. It's called craniosynostosis. Originally, we thought that it was a congenital birth defect, but 8 children have the premature closure of the sutures of the skull. Now, a pediatrician, an orthopedic pediatrician came from Johns Hopkins, and it is her opinion that what happened to this child and the 8 others, because this child is dead by 6, this child is forced to work by putting loads on top of his or her head. The body attempts to deal with that stress in closing up the bones of the skull. The problem is this child's brain is still growing. The trauma of enslavement, the trauma of overwork, is not only limited to children. We also see with this young woman, for you college students, this woman is in her early 20s. She is your age. She died a violent death. She's one of the few that we can clearly see died a violent death. Now, in this case, this woman was shot in the back with a musket. The musket ball shattered her left scapula and was lodged in her ribs, and that's what's pointed out there. Here you can see it more closely. This woman was also grabbed by the right arm, and what I'm showing here are the 2 bones of the arm. Her arm was twisted so violently that it broke this bone, the radius. On top of that, you can see that she's placed with the left side hidden. This woman was also punched or clubbed in the face. So you wonder to yourself, why was all this done? Was she part of a rebellion? Quite possibly. But also quite possibly, she burnt the clothes when she was ironing them. Or she dropped a bucket of water going up to the 3rd floor of a house, because we have a spike in mortality of women that are in their late teens and early 20s. We also know from the historical information, these women are employed or enslaved as domestics in homes by themselves, where they will not see another African unless they go to a marketplace, where they may not see an African who speaks their language. So think of abuse, think of violence against this woman. Here is a woman that died in her late 40s. We have the clear cause of death. In this case, the bottom of her skull was crushed. And the way that it was done, we believe very strongly, was once again putting an object on top of the head. The object is so heavy that the whole weight of the skull comes crashing down on your vertebral column. At least 7 women have these cranial vault fractures. We do not have too many elderly people in the African burial ground. This is one of the very few. This is a woman that is an elderly woman. She's aged past 60 years old. Finally, we probably know more about this man than anybody else. If you notice, this is the coffin lid of Burial 101. And on that coffin lid, you see some type of symbol, some type of shape. For those of us who are born and raised in the West, it looks like a heart, which gives you a completely different idea of what this man was trying to say in his death than if you know Akan languages. If you come from Ghana or Benin or Côte d'Ivoire. We have had art historians who have positively identified this symbol as the symbol Sankofa, which means it's no taboo to return and pick up what you forget. You have to go back into the past before you can go into the future. This man also has evidence of a parasitic infection called yaws. Yaws is originally an old world disease. Additionally, this man has filed teeth. This man is tall. He's about 6 feet tall. In other words, he had very good nutrition as a child. He is dead by 30. Look at how well formed his anterior teeth are versus his molars, which are basically either gone or just carry his shells. Finally, we come to this man. This is one of the few people that we've been able to identify in terms of the DNA analysis as being a European. Or in other words, I should put it this way. He shares genes with someone who is currently living in Northwest Europe. And you can see that he is holding something in his hands. What he is holding is the top of his skull. And once again, I think this is a very good example of people fighting back, resisting, maintaining their humanity. Now let me try to bring this roundabout. Right next door to the African burial ground was a doctor's hospital. And in the late 1700s, it was against the law. It was prohibited to work on cadavers unless they were criminally insane. So we have historical evidence that the doctors, the interns, were going into the African burial ground and taking bodies out. They were also burying the cadavers. Now, how do we know this? Because the African people complained to the equivalent of City Hall. City Hall didn't do anything about it. So what do you think happened? There was a doctor's riot, and these African people burned down the hospital. This is one of the many times that these people stood up for their rights. Rebecca Hall will be talking tomorrow. We know that there was a rebellion in 1712. We know that there was a rebellion in 1741. And the rebellion of 1712, I think especially, shows us the importance of the burial ground. Because after that rebellion, the British instituted 3 changes in the funerary laws. From now on, no African could be buried at night. That is an African cultural heritage. Secondly, only 12 people could be present at a funeral. And you had to get the permission of your master. Thirdly, no pall was allowed at the funeral. And when we think about being a pallbearer, you think about carrying the coffin. But the pall is what you place on top of the coffin. We see that in our society when a military or government official dies, we put the flag on the coffin. But in West African societies, they also use a pall. And it's finally come all the way around where Africans have visited Howard University. This is part of what was called the Fihankra Tour. This is a tour of Ghanaian chieftains who came to the United States basically on a tour of atonement, to atone for the fact that their ancestors sold the ancestors of African Americans into slavery. Now, unfortunately, I've only had 20 minutes to talk. Tomorrow, Joan Walker Scott has invited me to talk to one of the classes where we'll have a more detailed discussion. But at the very least, you are now introduced into the people that we've been talking about all day. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I will keep my comments short. That will allow us to have a little more time for questions and answers, and also allow us to move along into the direction we wish to go. There are a number of things that these papers illustrate, and one of them is that slavery was not just something between 1830 and 1860 associated with cotton. You know, we have, for example, the Cotton Club, and we know that some 2 million slaves in the United States, I think it's 2 million, were involved in the cotton crop in 1850. But in the past 30 years, studies such as the ones you've heard have allowed us to understand much more fully colonial slavery. That is to say, slavery before 1787, slavery before 1776. And we find that that particular institution of slavery in the colonies is very adaptive, very complicated. And most narratives on slavery up until, say, the 1960s kind of homogenized the institution, treating slavery in Virginia as if it were much like slavery in Texas or Mississippi or other places on the frontier, treating cotton as if it was a crop which existed throughout the era of slavery, when actually it came relatively late in the 19th century. And Fred Knight's paper shows the role of other crops in the creation of wealth in the colonial South. Indigo, a crop, for example, that I suspect most of us are not familiar with. And then, of course, there's the rice crops of South Carolina, and tobacco in colonial Virginia, the crop which destroyed the soil of colonial Virginia and led to a surplus of slaves and made possible the movement out into the West, because this surplus of slaves satisfied the needs of Westerners, people in Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas, for new slaves. I'll focus for a minute on the methods that have been employed. We see, for example, that when we look at a specific crop and a specific site, as Fred Knight has done, he's looked at a plantation, that is one, you might say, microscopic examination of slavery. And it's a very valuable one. We now understand how conditions of labor, for example, and living conditions varied, not only in terms of time, 18th century versus 19th, and crop, sugar versus tobacco, but in other ways as well. In terms of the specific crop, in terms of the size of the plantation, the number of slaves that were on the plantation, all of this is of primary importance in understanding this institution. So the crop and the specific site is one method that's very fruitful. Another method, as employed by Professor Foote, is to look at the historical literature on slavery. And she looks at Ulrich Bonnell Phillips' works, as well as those of Eugene Genovese, Benjamin Quarles, and a host of others. She focuses upon the language that they use. That's one of the things all the papers help us to do. They provide us with a vocabulary and with concepts which are useful for analysis. I might suggest that one of the reasons we don't wish to discuss slavery in this country is because we don't have the vocabulary to discuss it intelligently. We see it in terms of atrocities, we see it in terms of evil, which is true, or good, which was more popular in the past than today, but we don't really have the necessary language. And I always remind people, the term industrial revolution was coined at least 100 years after the industrial revolution began. Do you think it might be the same way with other processes affecting the nation and the world? Then too, Professor Foote looks at the, as she refers to it, the binary logic which informs these histories. We are a nation obsessed with polarities, good, bad, us, them, and it just goes on and on, hot, cold, white, and black, etc. Their story, our story, his story, her story, etc. And one of the problems with this mode of analysis is that there is no gray region, which is, I think, where most of us dwell and where a great deal of information is contained. So I think it's very useful to look at the language, the logic, the tools that historians use. As has been pointed out with Phillips, given his assumptions and the methods, that is to say, the documents of the planters, as opposed to the folklore of the slaves, his conclusions are predetermined. And that's the way it is with so many of these histories. Given their assumptions and their language, it's just an exercise to write the history because they know what they're going to say. And in our counter-narratives, we have to be very sensitive to the limitations inherent in the terms that we use, in the particular methods, approaches, etc. So there's the crop-specific site analysis, there's the examination of the works of history, historiography as it's known, the history of history, so to speak. We get that in graduate school. Others don't get it at all. You know, they think every history is equal. The third thing is that, as Mr. Mack has pointed out, there are new records and new methods to employ, such as DNA analysis. I might point out, for example, that one of our later speakers, Paul Finkelman, pointed out in one of his works that if you really want to settle the question of Jefferson's children, Jefferson fathering children by Sally Hemings, you should do a DNA analysis of Jefferson's hair, some of which we have. A decade or so later, that was done, and the conclusions that you may be familiar with were put forward. But as a result of these new methods, we can look at records that we could not look at before. Bones, for example. And this final presentation is one of the most intriguing ones. Now, the gentleman says he is not a historian, or to be grammatically correct, he is not an historian. And I disagree. He is a historian. Some people look at census data, which might have been, useful for some of the other papers. Others look at bills and legislation. And others look at bones. And when they look at these bones, they extract not just material for DNA analysis, but they extract tales. He actually allows these bones to speak to us 3 centuries after they were interred. And these bones tell us of the toil and suffering of these people. These bones speak to the violence heaped upon these people. Not just the blows to the head or bullets to the body, but to the work that they endured. You know, I'm always amused at people who talk about a labor shortage. Well, you see, the Native Americans, they died or ran away. So there was a labor shortage. So they imported Africans to make up for the labor shortage. And I always laugh at that. Were there not workers in Europe? How could there be a shortage of labor? I don't understand. Native Americans didn't suffer from a shortage of labor, and they built in the Midwest, for example, some magnificent earthen works which you should examine. Works which match the pyramids of Egypt in terms of their total volume, for example, and the labor that went into them. So I just can't understand this idea that there was a labor shortage. You know, the only people who have a labor shortage, I would suggest to you, are the exploiters, are the people who want to get rich quick. Now, they may have a labor shortage, but ordinary civilized beings, I may suggest to you, do not have a labor shortage. And these bones shed new light on this question of labor shortage. They tell us, for example, why people ran away to the west rather than endure this terrible labor. The bones speak of the death heaped upon the babies, the women, the children in particular. I noticed there were a disproportionate number of children in the graveyards. And these bones also tell us that black people didn't live very long. And that's what America has meant for so many people of African descent. And I mean this not only in the sense of the United States. It's meant death. That's what it meant. A slow death. Black men today die before they're eligible for Social Security. They die at 62, the same year they're eligible for Social Security. That's what the United States has meant. Death, as well as resistance, the other side of the story which comes out in these bones. You know, as he pointed out, they said that Africans came here with nothing. Well, not only did this African woman come here with something, she took it with her too into the next world, which is quite an act of resistance. And I said I wasn't going to speak long, and I got carried away, so I'm going to stop right there. We can look at crops and the language of crops. We can look at the histories, or we can look at new kinds of records. And this is one of the most exciting things that's been occurring in our studies of slavery, examination of new kinds of records. And then, too, I have to tell you that, to be perfectly fair, when you look at old records with new questions, you get surprising results as well. You're able to give to these slaves a certain amount of agency which they have been denied. I wish we had a little more time to talk about the subversion of history, because these bones, for example, these studies of what crops have done, subvert the history of the masters in the same way that they have subverted the history of the nation and the history of Africans. Now I'll stop there. And I think we have time for some questions.
I was going to ask you that. In the interest of trying to get back on schedule, would it be best to just invite people to share their questions over lunch, or should we take 2 questions?
I think we should take at least 2.
Okay, why don't we take 2 questions, and I'll just open up the floor right away. Any questions, comments, observations? Yes. Wait for the mic, please. Is there? Or yell, as the case may be.
Okay, my question is for Mr. Mack. I'm very fascinated by the tales that the bones tell. And I'm wondering about the cranium fractures of the children, because when we visit West Africa today, or throughout the continent, we see children carrying things that weigh a great deal, and I think it's an important highlight of the continuity that existed in New York and probably throughout other regions of the East. Have you thought about that? Have you considered the fact that children, as well as adults, were able to bear huge loads on their head?
Yeah, the thing that I think is different is look at the psychological effects of their condition versus people that are living in West Africa, Central Africa today. That's one thing. Secondly, the disease environment. The majority of people, we don't know what the causes of death are. But then again, think about cholera, smallpox, typhoid. They affect the body so quickly that you will not see it affect the skeleton. Thirdly, going into the historical records, specifically the coroner's report, what do you think was one of the major causes of death, for adults especially? Drowning. Because where were they working? On the docks, in the ports. You fall in the East River in December, and swimming is not the nationwide or the global sport that it is now, when you go back 250 years ago. But I think it's really a combination of the disease environment, undernutrition, and the psychological stress of being torn away from your homeland, the psychological stress of seeing your mother beaten, the psychological stress of seeing your father, and I didn't even get into this, seeing your father chained and starved to death in the town commons because he participated in a rebellion. Those things do have an effect on you biologically. That is much different, I think, than what we see in West Africa, Central Africa, in the Yucatan, in Mexico. It's a different thing.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom after a while. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.